The key lay on the solicitor's table on a square of blotting paper, iron, 4 inches long, with a label tied on in string. She was 29 and had been a widow 11 weeks, and the men in that office laughed before she had finished reading. There was no money in the estate, no furniture worth carting, no trade left in her name, no one in the district willing to take her on. There was her uncle's clay rule, boxwood, cracked at the joint, kept in the drawer since they carried him out of the yard. For £7 and the cost she took the old pottery at Ravenlock, 2 dead kilns, and 13 years of frost. But what Mr. Pelham Crick did not know, sliding the key across to her, was that in the casting room, near the middle of the floor, one brick was warm every dawn, and the reason for that warmth would change not only what she owned, but what the valley was permitted to remember. Tell me in the comments which town or which country you are listening in tonight, and whether you would have turned that key or handed it straight back. Hannah Worsley had been trained, without anyone intending to train her, to distrust a set of books that looked too tidy. Her husband Robert had been a jobbing builder in Burslem, a steady worker with poor judgment about who he took orders from, and for 6 years she had kept his accounts at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings while he read the paper and offered no opinion. She wrote a clear hand. She entered the day, the customer, the work done, the materials used, and the sum owing, and she ruled each month off in red. Because she did it every week for 6 years, she came to know the shape of an honest account the way a baker knows a dough that has risen properly. When a set of figures was wrong, she could usually feel it before she could prove it. That was the whole of her education in business, and it had cost nothing but her Sunday evenings. Robert died in the second week of October in 1866, of typhus, at 34, in the front room of a rented house on Snade Green with the window open because he said the air was thick. He left her his tools, a bad chest of drawers, and £106 of debt, of which £81 was owed to him and never came in. £31 of that was owed by Halloway and Son of Fenton for 11 weeks of brickwork and the rebuilding of 2 kiln bases in the summer. When she went to their counting house in November with the account book under her arm, the clerk read it and turned it round and told her that a woman's copy of a dead man's figures was not a document. 2 other clerks were in the room. One of them laughed, not cruelly, which was somehow worse, and she walked back the 4 miles because she had spent her fare getting there. Her other education had come from her mother's brother, Isaac Twyford, who was a slipehouse man at Ravenlock Pottery from the year it opened until the year the gates were chained, and who never in his life earned more than 26 shillings a week. He was a short man with gray in his eyebrows before he was 40. He took her round the works on a Sunday in 1853, when she was 15 and the place was still alive 6 days out of 7. He showed her the blungers and the slip troughs and the drying stove and the mold loft with its rows of white shapes like something out of a bakery. He let her stand in the casting room in January in her thin boots and feel the floor. The floor was warm. That was the thing she remembered longest, not the kilns and not the noise. There was frost on the yard, cobbles outside, and a skin of ice on the water butt, and inside the casting room, the brick underfoot was warm enough that the men worked in shirt sleeves, and the molds gave up their damp overnight instead of over 4 days. Isaac told her the heat ran under the floor from a small fire at the gable end, through a flue laid flat in sand, the way they warmed a drying stove. Joseph Dale had put it in himself at his own cost, he said, because a casting shop that froze was a casting shop that lost a fortnight every winter. Then he gave her the clay rule out of his coat, boxwood, 12 inches, with the shrinkage scale cut along the back edge, and he said one thing to her about it, and she never afterwards forgot the words. Measure what is there, not what you were told. She was 15, and she thought he meant the clay. Ravenlock closed in the autumn of 1854. Joseph Dale, who owned it, died the following spring at 51, and his widow Ann Dale, who was then 39 and is now 52 and lives with a cousin in Longport, was left with a daughter of 2, and a name that people in the trade said carefully. The word in the district was that Dale had overreached, that he had put money into a body that would not sell, that he had taken on more men than his order book carried. When the crash came, they said, he had gone under honestly and completely, the way a small master does. Isaac Twyford never once said that this was true and never once said it was false. He worked afterwards at 3 other yards, and at the last of them he lost the sight in one eye to a splash of hot glaze. He died in the spring of 1866, 5 months before Robert, and left Hannah the clay rule in a tin box with £4 in it. That was what she had then. On the morning of the assignee's sale at the Legs of Man in Burslem, in the second week of January in 1867. 4 pounds of her uncle's money, 3 pounds and some shillings of her own, a boxwood rule, a dead man's ledger that nobody would call a document, and 11 weeks of being spoken to as though she had already agreed to disappear. The sale was held in the long room upstairs, and there were 19 men in it and no other woman. Ravenlock came up as the 11th lot, after a quantity of scrap iron and a public house in Tunstall. Mr. Pelham Crick, who was 47, acted for the creditor's assignee, and he read the description out in the voice of a man reading a death notice for someone he had not liked. Freehold, 2 ovens, sheds, mould loft, offices, and about 1.5 acres of yard. Sold in such state as it now stands, with all faults, the purchaser to satisfy himself as to condition. He said that the buildings were unsafe, that the ovens would want pulling down, and that the value in it was the brick and the iron and nothing else. Nobody bid. Crick let the silence run because the silence was useful to him, and then a man at the back offered 5 pounds for a joke, and there was laughter, and Crick smiled at his papers and said that he could not take a bid made in fun. Hannah said 7 pounds. She said it in an ordinary voice and had to say it twice, because the first time nobody had thought the sound came from her. The laughter that followed was not loud. It was the sort that goes round a room in about 4 seconds and then stops of its own accord. 2 men turned to look at her. One of them, whose name she learned afterwards was Silas Rowe, and who was a solicitor of 55 with an office on Market Street, did not turn round at all and went on writing. She paid the 7 pounds and 1 pound 17 and 6 in costs and stamp, and she signed her name twice, and Mr. Crick was very pleasant to her while the ink dried. He told her that she was under no obligation to keep a thing she could not manage. He told her that his clients would be prepared, out of consideration, to take it off her hands at 30 pounds for the materials, which was more than a fair price, and that if she thought about it in a week, she would see the sense of it. Then he slid the key across the blotting paper and said that the casting room floor was rotten in places and that she should take a light and take care. The floor of the casting room was brick, laid on sand, and she knew it because she had stood on it when she was 15. Before she ever put that key in the gate, the question was already lying in wait for her, and it is the same one I want to put to you now. How does one brick, in the middle of a factory that has been cold for 13 years, come up warm every single morning before it is light? Hold whatever answer you have. She had 4 of her own inside the first week, and every one of them was wrong. She walked out to Ravenlock on the 22nd of January with a key, a candle end, a stub of chalk, 2 slices of bread and dripping in a cloth, and her uncle's rule in her pocket. It was 3.5 miles from her lodging, and the last mile of it ran along a lane with a hedge on one side and the flat white of frozen marl workings on the other. The 2 bottle ovens came up out of the ground ahead of her like a pair of stopped bottles. They were blackened to about 2/3 of their height and pale above that where the smoke had never reached in the last 13 years. The gate chain had rusted into one solid piece, and she had to go over the wall by a fallen coping stone, which she managed in her second-best skirt without much dignity and with nobody to see it. Inside, the yard was worse than she had allowed for. 13 winters had lifted the cobbles in waves. The ruts left by the last carts had frozen in 1854 and thawed and frozen again until they were a set of shallow white trenches. In the sheltered angle by the slip-house wall there was a drift of pale clay dust 2 inches deep that had never once been rained on. Broken saggers lay everywhere. The coarse fire clay boxes the ware was fired in, stacked in some places and smashed in others, and the pieces had gone the color of old bone. A barrow stood by the coal store with its wheel off and its handles pointing at the sky. Elder had come up through the middle of the clay yard and grown 11 feet. She did the thing she had come to do, which was to walk the property in order and write down what was there. She started at the northwest corner and went clockwise, and she wrote in pencil in the back of Robert's account book because paper was paper. Boundary wall, 190 paces, sound for the first 60, then a gap of about 4 yards where somebody had taken the coping for their own use. Coal store with a slate roof, dry. Slip house, roof half gone, the 2 blungers seized solid, the arcs full of a gray paste that had been slipped once and was now nearly stone. Mold loft over the throwing shop, 31 steps up, and the loft floor holding, and on the racks about 400 plaster molds furred white and green and mostly ruined by frost. 2 ovens, the smaller one showing a crack up the side that she could put 2 fingers into. Offices, 1 desk, no chair, no papers, a fireplace with a jackdaw's nest fallen down it. And the casting room, which was 42 feet by 26, with 11 windows down the south side, and of the 11, 9 broken. She had come to value the place so that she could decide within a fortnight whether to sell the ovens for brick, sell the site for the acre and a half, or find some way to lease the buildings for storage. That was the whole of her plan. She had bought it because £7 was less than a quarter's rent, and because a person who owns something is treated differently from a person who owns nothing. She had not admitted to herself the other reason, which was that Holloway and Son had a yard 11 miles off and had refused her £31, and that owning a pottery, even a dead one, put her in the trade they were in. She stood in the casting room on the afternoon of the 22nd, and it was so cold that the damp on the inside of the walls had gone to a fine gray frost, and she felt nothing under her boots at all except brick and the beginning of chilblains. She came back the next morning because it was the shortest way to look at the mold loft in a decent light, and she came early, before 8, with the sky still the color of dishwater. She walked in through the casting room. Halfway across it she stopped and stood, and then knelt down and put her bare palm on the floor. One brick was warm. Not hot, nothing like hot. It was the warmth of a plate that has stood 10 minutes off the fire, or of a stone that has had the sun on it, except that there had been no sun on anything for 9 days. The bricks around it were the temperature of everything else in that building, which was the temperature of the ground in January. She moved her hand out from it in a slow spiral and found the edge of the warmth about 11 inches away in every direction, and then nothing. She marked the brick with a cross in chalk and sat back on her heels, and did not think about ghosts, because her uncle had told her once that everything in a works that seems strange is a thing somebody built and then stopped explaining. What she thought about was sunlight through the south windows, which was the sensible answer, and she was still thinking it when she looked up and saw that the nearest window was 19 feet away and that the light through it at that hour fell on the opposite wall. By noon, the warmth was almost gone. By 3 in the afternoon, the marked brick was as cold as its neighbors, and she could not tell it from them except by the chalk. She went home to Peggy Allerton's lodging house on Waterloo Road, where she had a back room at 3 shillings and 6 pence a week. Peggy, who was 44 and had buried a husband and a brother and had another brother in Canada who wrote once a year at Christmas and never sent anything, gave her a bowl of broth. Peggy told her the works had been unlucky since before the Dales had it, and that a man had been killed there in 1849 by a fall of clay. Hannah ate the broth and wrote in the back of the ledger, "Warm at 8, cold at 3. The next morning she was on the wall at 6:30 in the dark, with a candle in a jar. The brick was warm. It was warmer than it had been at 8 the previous day. This time she had brought her uncle's rule, and she marked out from the chalk across a square of 6 bricks by 6. She laid her hand flat on each one of the 36 in turn, and wrote a number against each in her book, from nothing at all up to what she wrote down as blood warm. The shape the numbers made was not a circle. It was a long oval running roughly northeast, which is to say towards the gable end of the room, and it was narrow, no more than 2 bricks wide for most of its length, and it faded out about 7 feet along. She sat in the cold with the book on her knee and understood that she was not looking at a mystery. She was looking at a line. Anything that runs in a line under a floor was put there by somebody, and she had been told what it was 14 years before by a man in a coat that smelled of clay, in that room, with the heat of it coming up through her boots. There had been a flue under the casting room floor at Ravenlock. Everyone who had worked there in 1853 had known it, and nearly all of them had gone to Longport and Fenton and Hanley and Stoke, and some of them had died. The men who bought and sold the property afterwards had never set foot in the place in its working life and had bought a shell. That was the first thing she knew. The second thing did not follow from it at all, and it took her 4 days to say it to herself in plain words. A flue does not stay warm for 13 years. A flue is warm because something is burning in it. She made her first bad mistake on the 28th. She wanted to see what was under the brick, so she borrowed a cold chisel and a 2-pound hammer from Peggy's late husband's toolbox, and she cut the mortar out around the marked brick and levered it up. The brick came out in 2 pieces. Under it was about 1.5 inches of sand, and under the sand was a course of thin tiles laid flat. She got the point of the chisel under one of those and it gave way, and 3 of them dropped into the dark. Cold air came up around her wrists, smelling of soot and old fire. She had broken the crown of the flue. She knew it the moment it happened. She sat on the floor of the casting room with 3 broken tiles below her hand and a hole the size of a saucer, and she said something out loud that she would not have said in front of Peggy Allerton. Then she got a candle and put it to the hole, and the flame leaned and went out, and she relit it and it leaned again, which told her there was a draft, and told her nothing else. She could see about 9 inches down the passage before the light gave up. It was rendered inside with a smooth clay, and it was black, and it was perhaps 10 inches by 8, and it ran, as she had known it would, towards the gable. The next morning, the brick was cold. So was the whole line. She had let the heat out through her own hole, and whatever she had been measuring had been spoiled by the measuring of it, and she had lost the one thing in that building that told her anything. It took her 3 days to put it right, and she had to buy a peck of lime and a little sand and beg the loan of a trowel. She cut 2 tiles out of a broken sagger with a hacksaw blade to bridge the gap because she had nothing else the right thickness. She bedded them and packed the sand back and set the broken brick down in 2 pieces with the crack hardly showing. Then she had to wait because lime does not go off in a hurry in January. She went 4 mornings running and found nothing. On the 5th morning, the 2nd of February, she came in before light and knelt down and put her hand on the mended brick, and it was warm. She wrote in the book, 3 days cold, then warm again. Whatever it is, it stops and starts. February came in wet and then hard again. She gave herself a set of tasks and did them in order, because she had no money to waste on standing about. 6 years of Sunday evenings had taught her that the way to find the thing you cannot see is to write down every single thing you can. She chalked the warm line on the floor and extended it with a straight edge to the northeast gable. She measured the room in both directions with her uncle's rule and a length of string knotted at each yard. The casting room floor stood 4 inches higher than the throwing shop next door. She found that the doorway between them had a step down that had been made by cutting the bottom off the door frame at some time after the frame was set, which was the sort of thing a man does when he has raised a floor and cannot afford a new door. She went round the outside of the gable wall 3 times. The first 2 times she saw nothing. The 3rd time she looked at it in the low light of about 4 in the afternoon with the sun under the cloud for once, and she saw the seam. It ran up the outside of the gable from ground level for about 5 feet, and it was the width of a brick and a half. The mortar in it was a different color from the mortar either side, grayer and harder. There was no reason on this earth for a wall to be opened and closed in a vertical strip 5 feet high unless something had been taken out of it or put into it. She scratched the joint with a nail. The mortar was cement, and cement in that district, in that period, meant somebody with a shilling to spend on doing a job properly, and it did not mean 1854. Ruth Bagnall, who was 38 and sold eggs from a basket along the lane on Tuesdays and Fridays, stopped at the wall while Hannah was up on the coping and told her she was wasting good boots. Ruth had grown up at Chesterton, had lost 3 children under 2 years old and had 4 living, and had a husband on the boats who came home 8 weeks in the year. She said her mother had bought a set of blue ware from Ravenlock at the work store in 1850 and still had 6 pieces of it and would not use them. She sold Hannah 4 eggs for 3 pence and went on up the lane. She had nothing to do with any of what came afterwards, and Hannah thought about her for years, mostly at Christmas. Martha Kell, 52, who took in washing 2 lanes over, told her the works was bad ground and that the Dales had been proud people. Old William Frost, who was 71 and had been a sagger maker until his hand stopped, told her that Joseph Dale had been the best master he ever had and had paid his men on the Friday even in the last month when he had to borrow it. Then he told her, at some length, about a dog he had owned in 1842. Mr. Pelham Crick came out to the works on the 11th of February in a gig with the collar of his coat up. He was very civil. He walked round the yard with her and pointed at things and said what they would cost to put right, and his figures were not wrong, which she noticed. He said the small oven was unsafe and would want taking down before it took itself down. He said that he had spoken to the district surveyor and that in his opinion a notice would be served on the ovens before the spring. He said that he had been in the trade 30 years and had seen more men ruined by a cheap works than by an expensive one. And then he said, with his eyes on the gable end where her chalk marks were, that his clients would go to £60. £60 was 8 times what she had paid, 6 weeks after she had paid it, for a property that he had described in a public room as being worth its brick and its iron. She said she would think about it. He said that of course she must, and asked what it was that she had been measuring, and she said the walls. He laughed the way a man laughs when he has decided to find something charming, and got into his gig, and he did not go straight home. Tom Hollins, the carter, who was 26 and who hauled for anybody at 4 shillings the load, told her afterwards that Crick's gig had stood outside the Halloway yard at Fenton that same afternoon for the best part of an hour. Now she made her second mistake, and this one cost money. She had got it into her head that the heat came from below and from outside. Everybody in North Staffordshire knew of pit mounds that burned for years, and of marl workings where a seam had caught and smoldered underground, with nothing showing on the surface but a bare patch in the frost. There were old workings on the far side of the lane. A seam that ran under the boundary and under the casting room would explain a warm line in a floor and would explain why nobody had ever seen a fire, and it had the great advantage of requiring no person in it. She hired 2 men, a father and son named Hodgkiss, at £0.50 a day each. They dug a trial hole outside the boundary wall on the line of her chalk, 4 feet by 3. They got down 5 feet and found marl and clay and a horseshoe and no heat whatever. On the second day, they went down another 3 feet and struck water at 7 feet 6, and the water was as cold as water gets. She paid them 10 shillings, which was 10 shillings she did not have. She stood at the edge of that hole in the rain and looked at the mud coming up her skirt and made herself say out loud that the theory was wrong and that she had bought the answer she wanted instead of the one that was there. Measure what is there, she thought, not what you were told. And she had told it to herself. She went back to the wall seam, because the wall seam was a fact. On the other side of that gable, against the boundary, stood the old drying stove house, which was a small brick building about 12 feet square, with no roof left and a floor of ash and rubble. There was one great iron door, rusted shut, in the wall that backed onto the casting room. She had written it down on her first survey as a stove house, of no value, roof gone. She had not gone into it properly, because there was nothing in it, and because the way in was choked with elder. She cut the elder out with a billhook over 2 afternoons. Behind it, at the base of the wall next to the iron door, there was a low arched opening about 2 feet high that had been filled with brick. The filling was neat. It was also dry, and when she put the point of the chisel into the joint, the brick moved, because those bricks had been laid without mortar and packed round with clay, and clay can be picked out with a nail and put back with a thumb. She sat back on her heels in the wet ash of that little roofless building and looked at a wall that somebody had built so that it could be taken down. She took out 4 bricks. Behind them was a passage, brick-lined, about 2 feet 6 high, and going in level under the gable, and it was dry, and it had been swept. Not clean, swept. There was a broom's worth of soot pushed to one side of it in a low ridge, the way you sweep when you are working on your knees in the dark and do not much care. She lit her candle and went in on her elbows with her skirt bunched round her knees. 11 feet in, the passage opened out at a step down into a chamber. She put the candle up and saw ash on a hearth the size of a dinner plate. The ash was gray and fine and dry with a crust on it, and when she put the back of her fingers over it, she felt the last of the heat in it, and it was not 13 years old. It was 2 days old at the most. Beside the hearth, there was a candle stub in a saucer, a folded sack laid flat, a tin box with tea in it, and, standing against the wall where a man could take it up as he came past, a short iron poker with a bright worn patch on the handle where a hand had been. She got out of that passage faster than she had gone into it, and she put the 4 bricks back the way she had found them, and she sat on the cold step of the stove house for a long time with her hands shaking, and not from fright. Somebody had been coming into her works, in the dark, for 13 years, and lighting a fire the size of a dinner plate, and going away again. Nobody in the whole district had ever seen a light or smelled smoke, because whoever it was knew exactly which flue would take it and where it would come out. She watched the works for 3 mornings from the coal store, sitting on a sack with her back against the wall, and the door open 2 inches, from 4 o'clock until it was light. On the first 2 mornings, nothing came but a fox along the top of the boundary wall. On the 3rd morning, the 21st of February, at about 20 past 4, a man came through the gap in the wall where the coping had been taken, with a sack over his shoulder and no light at all. He walked across that ruined yard between the broken saggers and the frozen ruts without once putting a foot wrong. She let him get into the stove house. Then she followed him and stood at the low opening with her candle lit and said, in a perfectly ordinary voice, that she was the owner of the property and would be glad to know his name. There was a long silence out of the passage, then a scrape and the light of his own candle coming up, and a man came backwards out of the hole on his knees, 61 years old, in a coat mended at both elbows. He had the iron poker in his right hand, and his face the color of the ash on that little hearth. Elias Mercer had been an oven man at Ravenlock for 19 years and a placer before that, and he had set the last full firing that works ever fired in the September of 1854. He stood in the doorway of the stove house with the poker down at his side and told her, in the first 2 minutes, 3 separate lies, and she let him tell all of them. He said he came in for shelter. He said he had thought the place had no owner. He said he was doing no harm and would not come again. She said that she had put her hand on the warm brick on the 23rd of January, and that she had broken the flue crown on the 28th, like a fool, and mended it, and that she had counted 36 bricks with her hand on each of them and written the numbers down, and that she knew there had been a drying flue under that floor since 1851, because her uncle Isaac Twyford had stood her on it when she was 15 years old. The name did the work that nothing else would have done. He looked at her for a long moment. "Isaac Twyford's niece," he said. Then he sat down on the step with the poker across his knees, and he did not say anything for the space of about a minute. Then he asked her what she meant to do with the works, and she said that she had been minded to sell it for the brick until 8 days ago, and that she now had no idea, and that this was the truth, and she would not dress it up for him. He said that Mr. Crick had offered her £60. She asked how he knew that. He said that he had been coming into that yard in the dark twice a week for 13 years, and that there was very little about Ravenlock he did not know. He took her in, then, because he had decided something, and she went in first because he made her go first. And she understood afterwards that this was so that she could not say she had been led anywhere. Past the little hearth, the chamber turned to the right, and where it turned there was a wall of brick, mortared this time and properly built, with an iron door in it that had come off some oven mouth and been reset. He had the key on a string round his neck. Behind that door was a room about 10 feet by 8 with a barrel-vaulted brick roof, which had been the modeling store when the works was alive. It had been walled off from the passage by Elias Mercer and 2 other men in the November of 1854, over 4 nights, with bricks carried in 1 barrow at a time. The air in it was dry. That was the first thing she noticed, dry the way the inside of a bread oven is dry, and after 5 weeks of putting her hands on frozen brick and rotten timber, she could have wept at it. There were 41 plaster molds on the racks, wrapped in straw and paper, white and clean and whole, of a shape she had never seen in any shop. There was a shelf of sampleware, plain, hard, and so white that in candlelight it looked blue. There were 4 pattern books and 11 wage books, and a firing book kept in Elias Mercer's own hand up to the last day, and a bundle of letters in a Japan tin box, and a leather-covered notebook 11 inches by 7 with a strap round it, which he took down last and held for a while before he gave it to her. He had been keeping the damp out of that room for 13 years, with a fire the size of a dinner plate, twice a week in winter, less in summer. It was laid in the old flue mouth, so that the smoke went out through 400 feet of underground brickwork and up the base of the small oven, and came out cold and thin and gray, where nobody would ever look at it. She asked him why. He said that he had been at Joseph Dale's funeral in the April of 1855, and that afterwards Anne Dale had stood at her own gate with a child of 3 on her hip, and said that they had taken everything. He had told her he would keep what he could of the work safe until Susanna was old enough to know what her father had been. He said he had had no idea it would be 13 years. He said he had gone to a solicitor in Hanley in 1856 and been asked who he was, and had said he was an oven man, and had been shown the door in under 4 minutes, and had never gone to another one. Then he said the thing he had been working round to for an hour, and he said it flatly, like a man reading out a weight. "They did not fail us," he said. "They emptied us, and then they said we were empty." It took her 9 days at Peggy Allerton's kitchen table to work out what the book said, and she did it the way she had done Robert's accounts, in order, in pencil, 1 column at a time. The leather notebook was Joseph Dale's, and it held the mixings for a white earthenware body worked out over 4 years from the marl in his own field and a proportion of bone ash. It gave the date of every trial and the result of every trial, including the failures, of which there were 61. The pattern books held the shapes made from it. The firing book showed a full oven drawn on the 9th of September, 1854, of plain white basins, ewers, and feeding cups to a hospital pattern. The wage books showed 38 men and 11 women paid in that same month. And in the Japan tin, there was a contract dated the 4th of March, 1854, for 3 years, to supply the North Staffordshire Infirmary with plain whiteware at prices set out in a schedule, signed for the infirmary by its steward, and for the works by Joseph Dale. There was also a letter dated the 22nd of July that same year, on the paper of Holloway and Son of Fenton. It informed the infirmary that Ravenlock was no longer in a condition to supply, and offered the whole of the order from Holloway's own ovens at a penny under Dale's price. Gideon Holloway had held a quarter share in Ravenlock and 1,100 pounds of Dale's paper. In the November, he called the bills. In the December, the statement of affairs was sworn, and it said, in the clerk's fine copperplate, that the works had no live contracts and that the white body was experimental and of no commercial value. She read that sentence 6 times. Downstairs, Peggy was banging the range door about because the flue was drawing badly. Silas Rowe, the solicitor of 55 who had not turned round at the sale, read the whole of it in his office on Market Street in one sitting of 2 hours and 40 minutes, and asked her 3 questions and told her that she had 2 roads. She could take Crick's £60, sign a release, and go on with her life with more money than she had ever held. Or she could set the works going, prove the body could be made and sold, and sue in the name of Ann Dale for what had been taken, which would cost more than she had, take a year or better, and might come to nothing. He said he would act on the second road for his out-of-pocket costs. He said that he was not being kind and that she should not take it as kindness, because a case of that sort would do his practice no harm at all if it came off. She went to Longport on the 2nd of March and told Ann Dale, who was 52, and Susanna Dale, who was 15 and had been 2 years old when the gates were chained. Ann Dale said nothing for a long while, and then asked whether Elias Mercer had been well through all those winters. They started work on the 11th of March, and the first thing they made was rubbish. Elias came on at 15 shillings a week, which she paid out of the last of Isaac's tin, and a boy named Josiah Platt, 14, came at 8 pence a day and was worth every penny of it. They cleared the small oven, which was cracked but sound below the crack, and repaired 11 feet of its bag wall. She bought 3 tons of coke at 9 shillings the ton delivered, and Tom Hollins carted it. She got the marl out of Dale's field with a borrowed spade and blunged it in a tub because the blungers were seized. She made up the body to the mixing on page 40 of the leather notebook, and they cast 11 dozen pieces in the mended molds. She dried them on the casting room floor with the flue lit properly for the first time in 13 years, and she pushed it. She wanted the firing before the end of the month, so she dried them in 4 days instead of 9. She set the oven and fired it on the 29th. When they drew it on the 1st of April, out of 11 dozen pieces, 91 were dunted, cracked clean through the base, or warped past selling. 23 were sound. She sat down on an upturned sagger in the yard with a cracked basin in her hands. Elias Mercer looked at the floor and said, without any satisfaction in it at all, that Joseph Dale had allowed 9 days on the flue in a frost, and had allowed it for a reason. They dried the second lot 9 days. They drew that oven on the 24th of April, and out of 13 dozen there were 11 dozen and 4 good. Mr. Crick came twice more. In March, he brought the district surveyor's notice on the large oven and told her that his clients could not be expected to wait. In April, the coal merchant at Chatterley would not sell her coke on any terms. Tom Hollins came out to the works with his cap in his hand and said that he had been offered a standing 3 days a week by Halloway and Son and could not throw it over. She told him to take it and meant it. In May, the assignee served a claim that the moulds, the books and the sampleware were part of the bankrupt estate and had been concealed from it, which was, as Silas Rowe observed, an interesting thing for them to say about property they had sworn was of no commercial value. The drawing of the third oven was on the 4th of June, and there were 9 people in the yard for it. Ann Dale was there, and Susanna, and Elias Mercer, who had set the oven himself. Mr. Silas Rowe was there. Mr. Alfred Sneyd, 58, steward of the North Staffordshire Infirmary, had come out in a fly with a piece of ware from the 1854 delivery in his pocket, wrapped in a handkerchief. Mr. Pelham Crick was there because Rowe had given him notice of it, and Gideon Halloway, 62, came with him, which nobody had expected. They drew the oven from 8 in the morning. Hannah handed the pieces out of the mouth to the boy, and the boy handed them to Elias, and Elias set them on trestles in the yard, in rows. When there were 4 rows, Mr. Sneyd took his own basin out of the handkerchief and set it at the end of the first row, and stood back and looked, and everybody else looked, and there was no difference between them at all except that one of them was 13 years old. Sneyd turned the new one over. The mark on the base was the mark in the pattern book, and the pattern book was in Rowe's hand, open at the page, and the firing book beside it was open at the 9th of September, 1854. Gideon Halloway looked at the trestles for about as long as it takes to fill a kettle. Then he walked back to the gig, and Crick went after him, and neither of them said one word in that yard from first to last. The gate was open by then, because she had cut the chain off in February. The case never came to a hearing. In the September, Halloway and Son paid £140 to Ann Dale, and withdrew the claim against the moulds. They had a paragraph put in the Staffordshire Advertiser to the effect that the affairs of the late Joseph Dale had been misunderstood, which cost them nothing, and was read by everybody in the trade. Mr. Snade gave Hannah an order that June for 360 pieces at 10 pence, and a further order in the November, and the infirmary supply went back to the schedule of 1854 with the prices set again for 3 years. She took nobody on that she could not pay on the Friday. By the following spring, there were 9 of them at Ravenlock and 1 oven firing, and the big oven still stood cracked and cold, and stands so yet. Elias Mercer was made foreman at 28 shillings, and would not take more, and kept the key to the little room on the string round his neck. She went into the casting room on a morning in the December of 1868, before the men came, when there was frost round the inside of the broken glazing, and the sky over the yard was the color of dishwater. The flue was lit. She knelt down and put her bare hand flat on the mended brick, with the crack hardly showing, and it was warm. And it was warm because she had lit it, and because a man had kept it alight for 13 winters before her, so that 4 pattern books and a firing book and a bundle of letters would not rot in the ground. "Measure what is there," her uncle had said, "and not what you were told." He had been talking about clay, in a coat that smelled of it, when she was 15 years old, and had no notion that a rule cut in boxwood would ever be worth more to her than money. Hannah Worsley was 29, 11 weeks a widow, with no trade in her name and nobody in the district willing to take her on, and she paid £7 and £1.17 and sixpence in cost for 2 dead ovens and 13 years of frost. Of every sum she ever laid out in her life, that was the one that came back the furthest.